Millions of people across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland on Thursday voted for their local representatives in the 650-member House of Commons, the UK's lower house of parliament.
Now, there is no doubt that the Labour Party has achieved a landslide victory. And to discuss this, we're joined by our next guest, Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies, University College Dublin. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So, the Conservative Party had just went from a 14-year rule to a landslide defeat. What happened?
Well, let's start with the excellent news, just to reiterate that Larry the Cat is staying in 10 Downing Street. So there's a measure of stability that we're all pleased about. There is also the headline that you've got, which is this was not just a Labour victory, this was a Labour landslide. 412 seats out of 650, that's a majority of 164. On the other side of the equation, the Conservatives had their lowest return in history, modern history, only 121 seats. But to ask why it went wrong for the Conservatives, I think you've got to go beyond that headline for some equally important headlines. I think the first is that the Conservative Party, which in 14 years in government too often was marked by seeming to be detached from the people, being negligent, at points being so negligent that they caused many deaths, such as during the coronavirus, at times being accused rightfully of lying. I think that's particularly true of the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and being accused, I think at times rightfully even, of corruption. And I think in the final months before this election, the infighting in the Conservative Party between those who were trying to be the pragmatist and those who were moving to the hard right was beginning to rip the party apart. The broader headline is that infighting is going to continue. You're going to look at a civil war within the Conservative Party in the next few weeks and months, because the party on the one hand is being squeezed from the center by the Liberal Democrats, who got 71 seats, their best return in more than a century. But half of the Conservative vote was eaten up by this new hard right party called Reform. Now, Reform doesn't really have that many policies. It's got a very loud-mouthed leader named Nigel Farage, but people turn to it as a protest against the Tories. So do the Conservatives move hard right? Do they follow, try to work with Reform? Or do they tack back to the center? That, I think, is the immediate headline beyond the first headline. There are more headlines as well about some other parties, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Right, you've mentioned Nigel Farage, so let's continue on his topic. He finally got in, right? Now the Reform will have 4 seats, if I'm not mistaken. So what were some of their slogans? Why were people drawn towards them? And is it also another example of this wave of conservatism, or perhaps hard right, rising in Europe?
It is true that Reform now have a 5th seat. They won a recount just an hour ago. And these are the first 5 seats they have had in Parliament. But I think it's important for your viewers to realize this is not a mandate for the hard right policies or the hard right in the UK. Reform only got 14% of the vote. And almost all of it was taken from the Conservatives. It wasn't taken from Labour. It wasn't taken from other parties like the Liberal Democrats. In other words, they cannibalized the Conservatives. Why? Squeaky wheel gets the grease. Nigel Farage is a very loud politician. He has his own talk show on one of 2 national channels that are effectively Reform propaganda outlets, GB News and Talk TV. In this era of social media, in this era of division, some people are going to go for that. It's a politics of resentment. But it is very important to note that the party that did as well, in fact, far better than Reform, were the Liberal Democrats, who, as I mentioned, had only 8 seats going into this parliament and now have 71, 14 times what Reform has. And the Green Party, for the first time, has gotten more than 7% of the vote, and they have 4 members of parliament. This is not a story of the hard right taking over Britain. It's a story of a diversifying British politics, which, in the absence of proportional representation, is not reflected in a spread of seats. That's why you have the Labour landslide. but you are seeing more people going beyond the two major parties, who between them only got 58% of the vote last night.
All right, speaking of going away from the two major parties and the resentment of the people, I think it's also reflected in the turnout rate, which is also historically low. Do you think that reflects the resentment that you were talking about of people being tired of the two most mainstream parties being on the ballot?
Well, in part, it's because the system didn't work. Uh, a lot of people did not get postal votes. I live in Ireland, and my postal vote barely arrived in time for me to be able to return it. Uh, Voter ID was required for the first time. Some would say, because the conservatives were trying to suppress the vote. I'm sure there were some people who didn't vote because they didn't have the right identification. But I think also the idea that Labor was going to have what is called a supermajority, something that the conservatives were talking up in the last days before the election. I think some people thought, why do we need to go out to vote? Labor's going to win anyway. So that rate of 60%, it's about the same as what we had in 2001 during the Blair years. I'm not really concerned about that at this point because, like I said, what is interesting to me is the parties who have actually strengthened themselves on the ground. I think in particular the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, and those parties that have been weakened, in addition to the Conservatives, the Scottish Nationalist Party north of the border had a terrible night, dropping from 48 seats in Parliament to only 9, and effectively putting the question of Scottish independence on hold for quite some time.
Right, indeed. But let's go back to the root of it all, the fact that Rishi Sunak called this election. What does it mean for him now, the result, I mean? Is he done within his own party? What happens next?
He's done. I mean, you've seen Rishi Sunak was a pretty capable chancellor who was handed an almost impossible task as prime minister, given the absolute ineptitude, and in the case of Boris Johnson, the deception and the lies that preceded him. So when you get Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss, who lost her seat last night, that's how bad she's been. Sunak was going to have an uphill battle. The reason why he's not going to come back, I don't think he'll want to come back. I think he has a successful career in corporate finance. He has a home in California. But beyond that, the Conservative Party, at least for the moment, is going to swing very far to the right because most of the MPs who are from the center of the party lost their seats last night, whereas some very loud right wingers kept theirs. So Sunak doesn't really have a place in this version of the Conservative Party. Instead, what you're looking at is probably 3 women who are going to contest the leadership. Kemi Badenoch, Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, all of them whip up anti-immigrant rhetoric. All of them whip up rhetoric against multiculturalism. The only hope I think the Tories have to try to check that and to be pragmatic will be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, who unexpectedly held onto his seat last night and could run from the centrist wing of the party.
All right, speaking of Sunak not wanting to come back, something seems very out of the blue here. The timing of the announcement of this election comes at a time when Conservative polled the least popular ever. As well as just 2 weeks before the election, Sunak announced, their plan to bring back conscription, something that is, of course, pretty much poisonous to the polling numbers. So do you think there's a little bit of element of sabotage in there? I mean, self-sabotage, that is.
No, I think they gambled. I think they gambled because what had happened is that inflation, which had soared under the Tories during 2022 and 2023, going well above 10%, had dropped down to 2%, at least for the near future. And I think Sunak's gamble was he could say he had reduced inflation. We're turning the corner on the economy. Why he did it then and not wait for the election in October is I think Sunak also knew that the longer term economic news was not going to be good because Britain is effectively on the brink of recession. Britain has serious problems in terms of its trade figures. And I think the economic situation would have been much worse if he had waited until the autumn than going in the summer. The problem was that the Conservative campaign was just absolutely hapless. I mean, when you get Conservative members of Parliament and Conservative staff who are betting on the election after it's been called, that's a whiff of corruption, and it just adds to the idea that this party was out of touch with the British people.
Right, sir, but Keir Starmer was welcomed today at Downing Street. However, he inherits, as you've mentioned, quite a mess. So what is he going to do in the near future? What policies will we see?
Well, what Labour are going to do, they've already announced they're going to take 6 short-term plans to try to, as it were, limit the damage. They're talking about trying to deal immediately with waiting list in the health service, which is a serious issue here. They're going to try to deal immediately with financial planning, which is in an absolute mess right now within the government. They are going to try to deal with some short-term financial measures to try to get a little bit of money for public investment. In the longer term, what they're going to try to do is this very pragmatic approach to business, to finance and the city, and to try to renew links with other countries. But what they're not going to do, I think, is the problem. The one word that you did not hear throughout hours of election coverage, and I sat up through all of it, was Brexit. The fundamental cause of Britain's decline, economic, social division, its isolation internationally, is that decision to leave the European Union. And 24 hours before the election, Keir Starmer said, Britain will not rejoin the EU, indeed, will not even come back into the European single market in my lifetime. And the point here is if Labour do not come back into the single market, or at least lay out a plan to do so, they're trying to deal with a damaged, possibly broken Britain with one hand tied behind their back.
Right, sir, but wasn't the Scottish National Party, and as you mentioned, they did pretty badly in this vote, weren't they pro-EU?
Yeah, they were pro-EU, but the problem with the Scottish Nationalist Party is that they had a serious corruption scandal. The husband of the leader, Nicola Starmer, who had been a popular leader, has been implicated in it, as have been senior members of the Scottish Nationalist Party. They were caught with financial irregularities. They were caught trying to inflate membership lists, in other words, lying about them. That damaged their public reputation. In addition, Scotland, like the rest of the UK, has got serious issues with public services. And because the SNP is the ruling government in Scotland, it's a devolved system, they took the blame for it. They also had a very hapless leader who replaced Nicola Sturgeon. He was replaced only 2 weeks before the election. So it was primarily internal issues that did for the SNP rather than Brexit. I should add, by the way, that in Wales, which voted heavily for Brexit, you had the other way around. The Conservatives did not win a single seat in Wales last night. They have been completely evicted from that place only 5 years after they had ridden a Brexit wave to take several seats across that part of the UK.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight and helping us dissect this election. Thanks so much for being with us on TVP World. Appreciate it.
Scott Lucas was our guest.
Thank you, and thank all your viewers.